Alright, I'm Mark, staff engineer on Ads DSE. I lead work across measurement and audience targeting infrastructure. Before Netflix, I was CTO at a SaaS company for about 4 years. Before that, software engineer for 8 years across 2 companies. So I've sat in a lot of different chairs. Here's the ground rule for today. Ambiguity is the test. If something's vague in my prompt, that's deliberate. I won't volunteer the missing pieces unless you ask. We'll work through this together. More coffee conversation than formal interview. I'll push back, you push back, we see where we land. Here's the prompt. We want to launch a new audience product, something that lets advertisers reach what we're calling high-intent prospective churners on the consumer side. The idea: members who look like they're about to cancel their ads tier subscription surface to advertisers as a high-value audience to target. Marketing's excited. Sales is asking when they can start pitching it. DS is skeptical. It can be built precisely enough. Privacy is asking questions. There's no design yet, no PRD, no engineering scope, nothing. Walk me through how you'd approach this from a DSE perspective.
Got it. Before I propose anything, I want to pull on a few dimensions first. I'd rather anchor on the right problem than design the wrong thing fast. So first question, what's the actual business goal here? Is this a revenue play, lift fill rate, or RPI on a high-value segment, a differentiation play, something competitors can't offer, or a response to a specific advertiser ask? Because the framing you gave, marketing excited, sales asking, DS skeptical, that reads like an internal push, not an external ask. If that's right, the question becomes what strategic prior marketing and sales are reading off of and whether it's grounded.
What's your read?
My read is it's a differentiation play dressed up as a revenue play. Someone saw that churn-adjacent audiences convert well in other verticals and assumed the same logic applies here. That's a hypothesis, not evidence. And it matters because a revenue play and a differentiation play have totally different success metrics and different failure modes. Second dimension, who's the customer specifically? When you say, let's advertisers reach high-intent prospective churners, which verticals are buying this? CPG, auto, use-seated telcos, T-Mobile, a competing streaming service. Those aren't symmetric. Competing streaming services are categorically different from the others. That's not a nuance, that's a conflict.
Say more on the conflict.
If I'm Netflix and I surface a member who looks like they're about to cancel to, say, a competing streaming service, I'm not monetizing a high-value audience. I'm helping a competitor poach my retention misses. The revenue from that ad impression doesn't come close to covering the LTV loss if the member converts. So the advertiser value hypothesis for that vertical specifically isn't they're receptive to churn-adjacent pitches, it's we're doing the competitor's acquisition work for them. That's a problem I'd want to name before we go any further. Third, what's the operational definition of high-intent prospective churner? Is this someone with elevated cancellation probability in the next 30 days who hasn't started the cancel flow? What's the prediction window? 30 days, 60, 90? And what precision recall trade-off is implied? Because the tighter the window, the smaller the audience, and the more the advertiser value argument depends on the signal being clean.
DS says it can't be built precisely enough. What does that tell you?
It tells me either the model isn't there yet, or the model exists but was never designed for this use case. And there's a load-bearing sub-question underneath that. Do we already have the signal? Member retention has an internal churn prediction model. They use it for proactive retention interventions. Is the design constraint to reuse it, fork it, or build separately for ads? Each of those has completely different XFN implications. Reusing it means we're touching a model that another team owns and depends on. Building separately means duplicate infrastructure and probably a worse model. Forking is the worst of both. Fifth dimension, and this one's gating, privacy regime. Using a predicted churn classification to surface a member as part of a targetable audience. Is that covered by current ads tier consent disclosures, or does it require new ones? US and EU answer that differently.
Fair. And the sixth thing?
Scope and timeline. V1 by when, GA by when, what's the budget shape? Because marketing's excited and sales is asking can mean anything from we're pitching this in 2 weeks to we're vaguely interested in maybe doing this. That changes the risk calculus entirely. But the question I actually most want to come back to is why these members are high value to advertisers. That's the hypothesis that the whole product rests on, and my prior on it is partial at best. I want to be upfront about that before I go anywhere on design.
Okay, so you've got your clarifying questions out. Where do you land?
Let me state my prior directly because it shapes everything I'd recommend. I don't think we should ship the externally monetized version of this product as scoped. 3 reasons. First, misalignment of incentives. The ads team's success metric is revenue lift on this audience. Member retention success metric is keeping these members on the platform. Same member, opposite directions. Even if the math nets positive in a single quarter, the organizational dynamic creates long-term drift. The more revenue this audience drives, the more pressure to grow it, which means more incentive to classify members as high-intent churners and less institutional motivation to actually retain them.
That's a strong call. Say more.
Second reason, Netflix's stated posture. Netflix has publicly said we don't serve ads just to capture short-term revenue. Pitching our about-to-leave members to competing streaming services is the cleanest textbook example of that posture being violated. Even on non-substitute verticals, telcos, CPG, the pattern is directionally questionable. And third, the customer experience second-order effect. A member who's already showing churn signal and then sees more or different ads. What if the ad load increase is part of what's causing the churn? We don't know, and right now we have no instrument that would tell us. That's not a minor gap, that's a design-level unknown.
So you'd kill it entirely?
I'd kill the external monetization framing. The things that would change my no are: the advertiser value hypothesis pressure tests stronger than I expect, the consent question resolves cleanly, and we can show the incentive misalignment doesn't create the long-term drift I'm worried about. But absent those, yes, the no is firm. And I want to be clear, that's not a hedge, it's a recommendation. What I'd bring to leadership instead is a reframe, which I think is actually a more interesting product.
Let's hear it.
The reframe is this. Take the same underlying capability, a churn risk signal good enough to be operationally useful, and route it to member retention as additional signal for retention interventions, not to ads as an external audience. This does 3 things. First, it aligns the incentives. The team building the signal and the team consuming the signal now have the same success metric, retention lift on identified high-risk members. Second, it invokes Netflix's posture as evidence in favor, not against. We're using intelligence about churn risk to prevent the revenue loss, not monetize the way out the door. Third, and this is the part one find most interesting, it gives us a legitimate test bed for a much sharper product question that I think this case is actually hiding.
Which is what?
What if higher ad load is causally tied to churn for some members? Right now, we treat ad load as a fixed policy. Every ads tier member sees roughly the same number of ads per session, modulated only by inventory availability. But if churn risk is elevated for a subset of members, and we have a churn signal, we have a natural experiment that's never been run. Does reducing ad load for high churn risk members lift retention enough to net positive against the lost ad revenue?
Okay, I'm listening. What makes you think that's the actual causal story?
I don't, and that's exactly the point. I don't know if ad load is causally tied to churn. Nobody does because we've never had a clean instrument to test it. What I'm saying is, the original product accidentally handed us the prerequisites for a really important experiment. We have a churn risk signal. We have an ads tier population large enough for a tiered design, and we have a product question, does ad load drive churn, that Netflix presumably cares about answering regardless of whether we ever monetize externally. So instead of monetize the door levers, the reframe is churn-risk-aware ad load policy. A personalized ad experience product that aligns ad revenue and retention instead of trading them off.
How would you actually test that?
Let me sketch the design, rough but specific enough that DS could push back on it concretely. Population, ads tier members in the top quintile of churn risk score from the member retention model. At roughly 250 million ads tier MAU, top 20% is about 50 million members. That's enough for a tiered design with adequate per-arm power. This is a 3-arm trial, not 2. First arm, high tier reduction. Members with churn probability above 90%, ad load reduced by 25%, roughly 12.5 million members. Second arm, low tier reduction. Members in the 80 to 90% band, ad load reduced by 5%. Third arm, control. Members in those same risk bands, standard ad load.
Why tiered? Why not just treat versus control?
Because the interesting question isn't does reducing ads help, it's how much reduction is optimal. A binary design gives you a directional answer. A tiered design gives you the dose response curve. DS will want that, and frankly, leadership will want it too, because the policy implication of reduce by 25% for high-risk members is very different from reduce by 5%. We'd be designing a permanent policy decision off the back of this, not just an experiment. Treatment duration: 30 days of reduced load, then return to standard. Analogous to Netflix's existing 30-day reduced subscription fee retention play. So there's already a pattern leadership understands. After return to standard, we continue measuring retention for an additional 60 days to see if any lift sustains or bounces.
What's your primary metric?
Logo retention difference at 30, 60, and 90 days post-treatment start. Survival analysis for time to cancel as a secondary read, but the counter metric is the one I'd name explicitly because it's the thing finance cares about. Net revenue per treated member over the experiment window. Lost ad revenue minus gained subscription LTV from retained members. The break-even is whatever retention lift you need for that equation to net positive. I can't compute it without ARPU and ad RPM data, but the shape tells finance exactly what they need to surface the call. And 2 pre-registered stop conditions. If treatment arms show worse retention than control at day 14, kill, because that's a signal that reduced ad load reads as service devaluation to members, not a reward. And if the revenue cost exceeds finance's threshold for the experiment budget, kill regardless of the retention signal.
What's your assumption there about how members interpret a lower ad load? You're assuming they notice.
That's a fair push. The assumption is that the behavioral effect on retention exists, whether or not the member consciously notices the change in ad frequency. Churn decisions are usually accumulation effects, not single moments, so the hypothesis isn't member notices ads are lighter and decides to stay. It's lower friction across sessions reduces accumulation of the dissatisfaction that eventually becomes cancellation. Those are different mechanisms. And you're right that I'd want DS to weigh in on which one the survival analysis framework is actually equipped to detect. What I'd want from DS before launch is a power analysis on per-arm sample sizes, agreement on the survival analysis framework, pre-registered hypotheses, and an interim analysis plan at day 14 and day 30.
All right, XFN, who do you need to bring along on this, and how?
Let me pick the 5 that matter most and be specific about what each team's lens is and whether I'm aligning with them before the decision or informing them after. First, member retention. They're the consumer of the reframed product. Their lens is, does this lift retention without cannibalizing their own intervention budget? And do they actually get access to the churn risk score in a stable, trustworthy way? This is an align, not an inform, because if the signal interface doesn't work for them, the whole reframe falls apart. I'd co-design the signal contract with them before committing to anything.
Right.
Second, finance. Their lens is the net revenue break-even I described, specifically, how long the treatment runs before bleeding ad inventory becomes material. This is an align, not an inform, because the experiment budget requires their sign-off. I need ARPU and ad RPM data from them to compute the break-even, and I need them to set the cap on experiment cost before we launch. Third, privacy. Their lens is whether differentially treating members based on a predicted churn classification triggers new consent disclosures, and whether the classification itself counts as a sensitive inference under whatever regime applies. This is a gating decision. I can't launch without their formal review and written guidance, so it's an align, and it needs to happen early, not as a pre-launch checkbox.
Okay, keep going.
Fourth, data science. Their lens is experimental design rigor, per-arm power, pre-registered hypotheses, multiple comparisons correction, interim analysis plan. This is also an align. They own statistical validity, and if they're not bought in on the design before we run it, the results won't be credible internally anyway. The thing I'd want from them specifically is pre-registration of both the alternative hypothesis and the null. Most experiments get rigorous on what would tell us the treatment works and thin on what would tell us it doesn't. I'd want both. Fifth, PM on the ads tier experience side. Their lens is product clarity. Is this a temporary experiment or a permanent feature that shapes the roadmap implications for the surface this lives on? Also an align. I'd want a joint product brief and a scope decision on experiment versus feature before anything goes to engineering.
What's the principle behind who you align with versus just inform?
Align with teams whose incentives or judgment could actually change the design if surfaced early. Inform teams whose work this affects but whose call it isn't. Ad sales, for example. They need to know about revenue impact on segments they've sold to in case it affects pacing or fill commitments. But they don't gate the decision, so they get an outbound notification, not a co-design conversation. Brand and marketing are similar. I tell them in case the experiment surfaces externally, but they're not in the room when the design gets made.
Fair enough. Let me throw something at you. Say we run the experiment. 6 months later, DS publishes an analysis and finds that the retention lift we saw was a measurement artifact. The treatment our members were already going to retain at higher rates independent of the ad load change. What do you do that day, and what do you change about how you work?
First thing, sunshining immediately. Within 48 hours of DS surfacing this to me, I'd write a one-pager. What we shipped, what we believed, what DS found, and why we missed it. Share it broadly. Leadership, the XFN partners I originally aligned with, and any teams that consumed the result downstream. Not because process requires it. Because the teams that trusted my call deserve to know it was wrong before they hear it sideways.
And if leadership asks why this wasn't caught in the design?
Then I own the call specifically. Not we missed it. I missed it. And I'd name what I would have caught with more scrutiny. If the answer is I didn't push DS hard enough on what confounds the design was robust to, I say that. If the answer is I anchored on the retention lift hypothesis too early and didn't run the null hypothesis framing with equal rigor, I say that. Pick the real failure mode. Don't hedge into the team. This was my recommendation. The postmortem owns my part of it.
What changes going forward?
The substantive update is this. Pre-register the null hypothesis with the same rigor as the alternative. Most experiments are designed assuming the treatment works. The rigor on what would tell us the treatment doesn't work is almost always thinner. That's probably where this artifact slipped through. So going forward, I'd build that into how I scope every experiment, and I'd write it up so the rest of the org can adopt the framing, not as a postmortem appendix, as a working norm. And fourth, the reversal. If the retention lift was artifact, the reframed product doesn't have the evidence base I claimed. The call now is either kill the policy or run a better designed experiment with the new hypothesis framing. I'd recommend kill and restart over patching the existing one. The credibility cost of running a V2 on top of a flawed V1 is higher than starting fresh with the learning clearly documented. The one thing I would not do is deflect to the team. Sunshining their contribution is fine. Sunshining myself out of the call is not.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I'll hand it back to you. Anything you want to ask me?
Yeah, one thing I've been curious about the whole conversation. You were CTO at a SaaS company for 4 years before Netflix, so you came from a context where, as the CTO, you could just decide. A cross-functional call could end when you made the call. When you joined Netflix's ads DSE, what surprised you about how cross-functional decisions actually get made here compared to that? And what did you have to unlearn?
Honestly, the thing I had to unlearn was that alignment and decision are the same thing. At a smaller company, if I aligned the right people, the decision was made. Here, alignment is the beginning. The decision is a separate act, and sometimes it's not clear who makes it. The loosely coupled model means teams can block you by just not moving, without formally saying no. I spent my first 6 months trying to find the org chart that explained who could say yes, and eventually realized the question was wrong. The question is who can say no, and how to make it more expensive for them to say no than to move. That took a while to internalize.
That's really useful. And honestly, that's exactly the thing I'd have expected to be hard to see from the outside. I appreciate you being straight about it.
That's time. Thanks, Nafal.
Thanks, Mark. Good conversation.